get in the time machine. Today we are going back to 2015. And wouldn't we all like to go back to 2015 at least a little bit? But we are throwing it back to the books I was reading a decade ago. I did this last year with the books I was reading in 2014, and I thought it was a lot of fun and really fits this time of year for me personally. While I missed daylight savings time proper, it is my birthday month where I'm already kind of reflective, and it's the end of the year, and I think it's just a good time to kind of reflect on where we've been. And if you have not been with me before, hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. And if that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little bit longer. But who was Melody 10 years ago? I'm particularly excited to revisit this year because there were a lot of changes going on in my life a decade ago. It was the year I moved to Chicago, so this was my 10-year anniversary in the city. And of course, I was an early mid-20 something coming to the city with dreams of being a theatrical dramaturg, which I achieved to some degree, but have really pulled back from since 2020. And it's also interesting to think of my life in Chicago as kind of split down the middle by 2020, and the 2015 to 2020 period feels so much longer ago than it was, and also feels like it's so much bigger than it was in terms of time. Like it feels like the last 5 years are very condensed, and 2015 to 2020 loom very large in a way that they were a much smaller, it was a much smaller fragment of time than it really feels like sometimes. And 2015 was particularly big for me in terms of my reading life. We talked about last year it being me kind of starting to find my footing as an adult reader, it being my first reading year outside of college and what that looked like. And this is kind of forwarding that trend and me growing into the reader that I have become in whatever way. And of course, as much as it's a reflection on me personally, it is also a reflection on kind of where publishing was at the time and is kind of a litmus of how far we've come and if we've come far enough in some ways, which would probably be another discussion. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through and I will throw the books up to the side. I've done some screenshots because I don't have like a fuller view of them, and I'm not going to talk about every title because I read 232 books in 2015 and I'm not going to keep you that long, though I'm sure I will go off on some tangents and some stories related to some of them. And it's also interesting for me to think about like how some of these books have stuck in my mind, maybe not the contents as much as the memory of where I was reading them or the circumstances surrounding. At the same time, going through this is going to be kind of like exposing my journal to you in some ways, even as it's public facing, and now I tell you every month what I'm reading, but there's something about looking at a past version of yourself through this lens that is really vulnerable at the same time. So let's go ahead and dive into what I was reading in 2015, and feel free to chime in with where you were in your reading and your life as a reader in 2015. If you read any of these books in 2015 or after, and just how maybe you're recontextualizing reading a decade ago. It's wild to think, like I kind of glanced at some of these titles and it's wild to think that some of these were a decade ago. And it's also interesting because there are things that I've kind of misremembered in the timeline clearly where I read them. And, you know, at this point in my Goodreads history, I can trust the dates because I joined Goodreads in 2007. So 2007 and before, there's a little bit of mistrust that I have in terms of the read date, but anything after, that's when I read it. I was logging it in real time. So it's interesting kind of how I've misremembered the association of some of these reads in context or in relation to other books when maybe they were more closely in proximity with other reads than I had remembered. Just kind of interesting how all of that coalesces in the mind. So with that being said, again, we have a lot of books to kind of scan through, so let's go ahead and dive into them. So at the start of this reading year, I was still in Indiana. I moved to Chicago, I want to say around May. Yeah, it was around May 4th-ish. May 4th is my half birthday. I moved up the weekend after my brother graduated college, which would have been the very beginning of May, and I got the kind of reminders of that around my brother's wedding this year, which I found really full circle in a kind of bittersweet way, like kind of gauging my life in Chicago against these large milestones in my brother's life is kind of neat. I should have had this open beforehand. It is a lot of clicking of the more books and scrolling, so we are getting to the beginning here. I'm also going to work really hard to stay in focus for this entire video, so we will see. So, okay, first thing I read was Everything Leads to You by Nina LaCour, which is kind of interesting because I don't remember this title as specifically as I should, but Nina LaCour has woven through my channel since I started talking about books. I talked about one of her young adult books that I loved around 2020, 2021-ish, and I think that was a pretty popular Feature Friday. Obviously, Feature Friday book reviews kind of vary in viewership. And then we talked about her adult debut as well, Yerba Buena. So very much an author I have continued with. And then we have Yes Please by Amy Poehler, which is interesting because for some reason I remembered this earlier, like the Tina Fey, Amy Poehler kind of era of nonfiction of books. I had misremembered as closer to graduation, so this was a little later than I had remembered, and of course that was a very specific time in celebrity memoirs and a very specific voice. I remember having some beef with the Amy Poehler one because it felt like she was mentioning a lot, to my recollection, writing to the deadline or having to write the book in a way where I remember feeling like, okay, well, there's a lot of people who would feel privileged or really want to have a book published, and I'm just not as interested in hearing about your struggles finding motivation to write the book that I have paid money to read. I mean, I checked it out from the library, but still, my tax money paid, my library paid for that copy that they could have spent on something else. So I think that that is that particular kind of humor from the time, and honestly, I've read it in memoirs since, and I want to say in some memoirs that have cited Amy Poehler's memoir while doing that even. But overall, it was great. I am a fan of Amy Poehler, so I remember liking that, but I do think that the Amy Poehler, Tina Fey memoirs are of a very specific era of celebrity memoir and celebrity comedy memoir, but they also helped me get into audiobooks. Like, these were the books that really helped me find my footing with audio as I was getting more into audio now that it was available on my phone. I could adjust speed as I needed, and kind of nonfiction and comedic nonfiction really helped me ease in to becoming an audiobook reader. So I really enjoy it for that aspect as well. Then we have The Winter's Curse by Marie Rutkowski, which I don't remember as specifically like the book itself, but I remember it being kind of the zeitgeist of young adult kind of romantic fantasy at the time, and the cover is such a kind of moment in young adult covers to me, that kind of ball gown. It was the ball gown era, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I liked the ball gown era. I like a beautiful dress on a young adult novel, so I liked the cover. I don't know if the cover like fully encaptures kind of the stakes of the novel, but it was that kind of like high historical fantasy setting to my recollection with a romantic turn. I think this was kind of like vaguely Roman inspired, if I'm remembering correctly, but don't quote me on that. Then we have The Opposite of Loneliness, Essays and Stories by Marina Keegan. And I have a story with this one. This was a really great collection of essays written posthumously or published anyway after the author's sudden and very tragic death as she was very young. And I think it's a great, great essay collection when you are in your early 20s especially. And I don't remember all of the specifics of the essays as clearly as I would like, but I remember really enjoying it and finding a lot of value in it in that time of my life. What I remember more specifically is Emma Watson tweeting about this book, and in a way where it didn't feel like it was a PR person or like someone handling her account. And it may very well have been, but it seemed to be like genuine engagement with her saying, I loved this book, and kind of soliciting opinions and trying to get other readers' thoughts on it. And I responded. And I don't know that I have any of the screenshots from this anymore because I got rid of my Twitter, and I don't remember if I saved anything, or at least I haven't engaged with my Twitter in a way that I don't know if I can recover it. But I tweeted back at her, right? Kind of just throwing into the void. I just read it. I had a lot of thoughts and feelings. I was kind of boosting Never expected anything more than that. However, Emma Watson responded with just agreed, which meant a lot to me because I really respected and still respect Emma Watson to whatever degree. And I was like, oh, yes, I had a thought that she found valuable, or the person running her social media account found valuable. So that was like a nice kind of like, in that era of the internet, celebrity interaction. However, it also made me very, very aware of celebrity notifications on social media because she had responded to me directly. So then if anyone was popping in and responding to her tweet, I was getting tagged in it, in that response. And people were like spam responding to her on that tweet. And some of it was very much spam. Some of it was trying to join in the conversation, or joining in the conversation, not trying, legitimately joining in the conversation. And some of it was just vitriolic. And I was seeing it, but also very aware that I was seeing such a small fragment of what celebrities would see in their notifications every day. And I'm someone who does not like notifications. So that was a lot for a very brief period, right? Because the cycle moved very quickly, but it really recontextualized for me celebrity engagement in online spaces. And I was like, yeah, I totally understand having someone to just run your account, because that would be too much for me, for sure. But the moral of the story is Emma Watson agreed with my opinions on this book. And then we have Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. My potentially controversial take or opinion is that that is the last of that series that I read. So there's that. And then I read Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. And this was my first Celeste Ng, and it still holds such a very special place in my heart. I remember I borrowed it from the library, and after I was hired as a bookseller, when I got my bookseller discount, I made sure to buy a physical copy of this book that I still own. And it's an example that I think of and return to often in terms of, I have a habit of saying, oh, I don't like this thing in a book, right? But then if you've been with me for a second, you know that I then say, but I don't like to really say that, because every time I say that, I'm kind of proven wrong, or I find something where it does work for me. And this is definitely an example of that, in that it is a book that is kind of like a family saga. It's heavily steeped in grief because it's following the loss of a child, a sibling, and kind of like the family's reaction to that. And there is cheating as an element of this book. And a lot of those things are kind of harder for me to reckon with in fiction, or I might not seek out as actively. And generally, I don't like cheating just because I just don't like it. Like, I recognize the narrative kind of purpose and functionality of it, and that it's important, and it, is unfortunately common enough that it's a story to be told. Anyway, I loved this book. I do need to catch up on my Celeste Ng, but as of now, I think this might still be my favorite. But I did have just a really emotional reaction to it, and that kind of looms large. So that was that one. And then kind of skipping ahead again, I recognize I've been talking about a lot of these, but okay, so Made of Secrets by Jennifer McGowan. This is, and I know I mentioned this series briefly before, I really enjoyed it. I'm devastated still that it never finished because it kind of got dropped before. I want to say there was maybe one or two more books, but it was a historical young adult series following like a group of young women who were spies for Elizabeth I, and each book followed a different girl from the group. And sometimes and frequently there was like a romantic component as well. But I just loved these. I ate them up. I think the third one was my least favorite. This was the first one. And this was like definitely the kind of historical fiction I was into, especially at the time. But if we got something like this again today, I'd be there in a heartbeat. Then we have Swipe and Shift by Kathy Reichs, which I can't remember if these are the novellas or the novels, but these are definitely from the Kathy Reichs YA series that was a Bones spin-off, but was a Bones spin-off in the kind of paranormal shifter vein, but with science. So it's following like a young group of friends. I think the female protagonist is the niece of Bones, and they are basically like infected with science and become werewolves and then solve crimes. Delightful and very much of the moment. The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry by Gabrielle Zevin. This was my first Gabrielle Zevin. I still need to watch the movie, but am I ready for that emotionally? Because this book wrecked me. So there's that. The Bane Chronicles, because it was still that era. Land of Love and Drowning, I mostly remember reading on my iPad in the teacher's lounge. This was the era when I was still reading on my iPad. That's not the life for me anymore. I need the higher contrast. I can't do like a screen in that way generally. American Born Chinese, obviously delightful. Get in Trouble by Kelly Link, still my favorite Kelly Link, though I am not up to date. I loved this collection. I also remember, I think I remember reading this, again, I have a lot of like memories connected to where and the what of physically reading. Subbing in music, like in band, and I remember having a prep period and like reading this, and from across the way there was like an independent study, a student doing a piano independent study, and I heard just the one note. You know, millennials, the one note. And I remember hope being restored, that Welcome to the Black Parade was not being lost, that it would remain. And I had to work to stay in my seat and not go visit that student because he wouldn't have gotten my excitement. Anyway, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Amor McBride. This is very stream of consciousness. I actually have contemplated going back to this because I remember finishing it and then putting together that the poem, it was kind of following, what poem was it? Oh, poo. It was one of the fairy poems, like one of the really famous fairy poems. And I remember going back and going like, oh, I think I missed a whole bunch with this. Stream of consciousness is not my favorite, I will admit. This book also helped me learn that I can hold a grudge. In 2016, when I went to Book Expo America, and I was like wandering around with all of my tote bags filled with books, and I was looking at the new McBride, and the person working the booth, I want to say it was the Penguin Random House booth, looked me dead in the face and said, oh, that's not young adult. And then I took it with me because I was offended. I mean, I was reading young adult too, but I just didn't like the implication. Anyway, Only Enchanting. This is one that feels kind of like outside of what I thought, or when I thought I read this. I thought I'd read this series much earlier because I think that this is part of the Survivors Club series, which is still my favorite series by her. I say having been kind of disappointed by the one I read from her earlier this year. Anyway, that feels kind of outside of my memory. And then Burned by Carrie Marie Monning. This is where the Fever series started to go off the rails because it's the follow-up to Iced, where Monning realized she had written herself into a corner in how we were approaching Danny. And so this is where we bring back Mac and Barrons more centrally and kind of mess up what we had established as the kind of really satisfying resolution of the first 5 books, in my opinion. Anyway, happy 20th anniversary to the Fever series, which is making me feel really old. Anyway, okay, and then we have the second in the Elizabethan murder mystery, not murder mystery, it's more spying, and I do love spying, and Elizabeth was famous for her spying, so that works. Broken Monsters. This was a very specific time for Lauren Bukes, and Lauren Bukes was huge at the time with The Shining Girls and then Broken Monsters, which came out around 2015. And while I wasn't a bookseller yet when I'd read this, shortly forthcoming, it was a hot point of debate on the sales floor when I was a bookseller about what the best Lauren Bukes was. At the time, I was team The Shining Girls because it is about a time-traveling serial killer and is set in Chicago. And that is definitely up my alley for the time travel alone. Broken Monsters is also Midwest, which is interesting to me knowing that Lauren Bukes is from South Africa, just like how I don't remember being like kind of jarred by her depictions of the Midwest. Anyway, we had a strong Broken Monsters contingent. I feel like I would need to reread Broken Monsters because I do think I reread The Shining Girls years later, and I feel like I approached it potentially differently, but I don't know if it was enough to reframe or for Broken Monsters to overtake as my favorite of the two, and I still haven't watched the show either. Legend by Maria Lu, another kind of giant of this time. There are going to be a lot of giants at this time that my brain didn't fully comprehend all existing together and or having been read in the same reading year, which is kind of wild, including following directly to All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han. Wild. Then we have an appearance from The Lunar Cycles with Ferris by Marissa Meyer. We have I Was Here by Gail Forman. Definitely very big time for Gail Forman and young adult at this time. Shadow Scale by Rachel Hartman was the sequel and conclusion to the Serafina duology. I loved those books. Maybe I should reread those. If you like dragons and you have not read Serafina, please read Serafina. And then we have A Cold Legacy by Megan Shepherd, which I don't remember as distinctly. Is this a Frankenstein retelling? Either way, this is part of the kind of Gothic renaissance in young adult literature at the time, when I've talked about some of the return of that in young adults now, and some of the potential framing from certain authors or publishers that it's kind of the first time it's been done. No, this era, I want to say like 2013 to 2015, 16 especially, this was a big time for that kind of Gothic young adult fiction. And as I mentioned in my October wrap up, it was really interesting revisiting Frankenstein recently and being able to kind of recontextualize how much inspiration a lot of these young adult books at the time drew from Frankenstein, which I knew, but how much of a sliver of the text it really was in terms of where I saw the inspiration in these books coming from. So I know I had a friend, again, who wrote a thesis on that, kind of comparing Gothic literature to the young adult, the Gothic young adult of the time, and I feel like I should bug her for that because that's really interesting. The Falconer by Elizabeth May is interesting because I think I read somewhere, probably Threads, to be completely honest, because I just put together that she also writes historical romance, I believe under a different name, but my brain wasn't putting the two together. Probably the same part of me that took forever to realize that the Iva Abedson who wrote books like The Countess Below Stairs was the same one who wrote Paranormal Middle Grade that I ate up when I was in or reading middle grade. There was one that was like Platform Something. And then did she write Dial a Ghost? I can't remember if she was Dial a Ghost. I remember enjoying Dial a Ghost though. I did not read that in 2015. Anyway, I read somewhere that this was originally envisioned not as a young adult, but at this time, 2015, a lot of projects were being repackaged to fit young adult, especially like young adult fantasy, because it was huge at the time. And so it has been potentially re-released with or for an adult audience. And I would be interested in revisiting, though I don't know that I remember the source material well enough to really be able to judge where those differences are, other than some that I'm sure would be obvious. The Rosie Project by Graham Simpson was everywhere at this time. I remember it being fine, but like people loved this book. I think it may have won a Goodreads Choice Award that year, but I'm not going to fact check that in this moment. Just know that while I have not heard about it, probably for like 8 years, it was everywhere this year. Brazen by Catherine Longshore. This was young adult Tudor historical fiction. I loved Catherine Longshore's Tudor historical fiction. She had a book, especially I think about Catherine Howard, that I particularly loved. I don't remember, was it this one that was the Catherine Howard book? No, this was the Mary Howard book. But if you like Six the Musical, one, I have a whole video recommending books to read if you like Six the Musical, and this is definitely on that, or Catherine Longshore is definitely on that, as is the Elizabethan Spy series. Anyway, Seize the Night. I had a lot of grand ambitions that I was going to read all of the Sherilyn Kenyon backlist. I did not succeed in that. Maybe I should revisit, because Sherilyn Kenyon is such like a stalwart. Like when I think paranormal romance of this era, she is one of the names that comes to mind first. Another book that was everywhere at this time, All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven. Niven? There's a movie around this. I know that this was everywhere when it came out. I didn't like this book. I read this book for its Indiana connections, but it was set in southern Indiana, so I didn't actually even really see my part of Indiana reflected in this book. I thought its mental health, or I found its mental health, or its depiction of mental health, not the best. Anyway, An Uncertain Choice by Jodi Headland. I remember I requested an arc of this because it was a medieval young adult, and I was even closer to my Julie Garwood phase at this time, and I was like, yes, a medieval young adult historical romance. I need it. What I didn't realize was that it was a Christian young adult historical romance, which could be neither here nor there. But one, it was bad. It was badly written. I thought it was badly written. It's been a decade. I'm gonna say it. And I've also said it before now. But another piece that really bothered me, especially with the Christian connotation, blatantly, was its strategic use of the poor to kind of be this nameless stand-in to make the protagonist look better. Like, look how good she is. She cares for the poor. I found it really icky, and I didn't enjoy this book. So there's that. The Shadow Cabinet by Maureen Johnson, though, I did enjoy. I really liked this era. This was like the ghost era of Maureen Johnson, and I need to swing back and finish her mystery series, which I was enjoying, but I really, really liked the Shades of London series. And if you enjoy her mysteries and haven't swung back to those, there's still like a mysterious angle to it, but there's also a paranormal angle, ghosts. I love a ghost. And I think, if I remember correctly, there may be a Jack the Ripper kind of connection, but don't quote me on that. The Girl on the Train. Here's the start of the thriller, like where I was reading at least some thrillers. The Girl on the Train was The Girl on the Train. Funnily enough, despite how big this was, how it was everywhere. Like, if you ask me what my time as a bookseller was, it was The Girl on the Train and The Nightingale / All the Light We Cannot See. Those were the two camps people wanted recommendations for the most. So I was trying to read to give recommendations for those. I still have not read The Nightingale. Okay, Hausfrau by Jill Alexander Espaham. This, I think, was ahead of its time in some ways. It had very middling reviews. I remember reading an arc of it and loving it. It is a kind of inspired by or reimagining of Anna Karenina, or there are clear Anna Karenina kind of motifs throughout, and I feel like it's very much something that you should check out if you like the kind of sad girl books. It's very much like that high literary fiction. The cover is gorgeous. It's also the kind of start, or the early start, of a lot of the florals on book covers and the trend of that. I liked it. So that's all I have to say about that. Speaking, though, of retellings, Jane by Patricia Park, I also really enjoyed. It is a reimagining of Jane Eyre in Manhattan, and Jane is a half-Korean nanny in Manhattan. I remember enjoying it and thinking it had something unique to say. I think I won that in a Goodreads giveaway back in the day, too. Another book that feels kind of out of place, The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. I could have sworn I read this when, at the very latest, when I was in Cleveland, but apparently not. But we always have time to appreciate some The Cruel Prince, Holly Black. I believe this was still before The Cruel Prince, because I think I was reading her pretty on release, or on par with release. The False Prince by Jennifer A. Nielsen, I don't remember much about, but I remember liking it. So maybe I should revisit. I feel like I have The False Prince and The Thief, like that series, kind of meshed together in my mind. And so I need to recontextualize. Like, one of them had a component of like a competition, but I don't remember which one it was. The Penguin Book of Witches, edited by Catherine Howe, was the first I remember encountering of what I feel is kind of a stalwart of Penguin at this point, where they collect fragments of particular primary sources around a certain subject, like witches, like mermaids, which I still need to read. I think they have demons, exorcisms, things of that nature, and kind of look at them across a spectrum, which I think is a very interesting kind of look. Of course, they are edited, the passages are picked very specifically, but still like a nice kind of primer, and I like the idea of being able to look at different ideas throughout time and cultures in terms of writings, so that's really fun. Euphoria by Lily King was huge at this time because drama around anthropology is sexy. I think it was anthropology. and then A Darker Shade of Magic, which was my first V.E. Schwab. And I remember, so I was an ARC reader at this time already, or I was, on NetGalley, and I don't remember if full arcs, I'm sure full arcs existed for this, but I was not someone that was going to have access to them because even though she obviously is not the V.E. Schwab that we know today, this was a lead title to my perception in the sense of I was seeing it everywhere, or maybe it was just that it was checking all the right boxes for me. Either way, I didn't have the full arc. And I don't like to do like those previews, like the 3-chapter previews or the snippets that publishers will sometimes release for books, just because I find I either want it or I don't. I'll just wait. For this one, for some reason, I could not wait. And so I downloaded the sample and I remember reading it while eating some pizza and being just so impatient for this book to come out. And I tried to buy it at the DePaul Barnes& and Noble when I was in town, I think apartment hunting, surely, because I don't think I was living here yet, because if I was working in a different bookstore and I would have bought it there. And I remember them not having it and them being kind of confused, like not sure. And that being my first kind of instance of a first print run selling out before I could get it. Because they're like, well, we don't have it, but why not? We have it on order, but there's none in stock, that kind of thing. So this book was the start of my love of V.E. Schwab. I loved the idea of traveling interdimensionally. I definitely cried a little bit when I got to get this book signed and when I saw that she signed it Ostravars. Anyway, this book was the start of a love affair with V.E. Schwab for sure. And then we switch emotionally very abruptly and go directly into All the Rage by Courtney Summers, which I did arc read for. And this is kind of like the speak of this generation. This was a really harrowing, hard read in a lot of ways, but it was also so well written, and the emotion it invoked was intense, and it was important storytelling, especially for young girls who had been through encounters where they are not believed when, a golden boy may take advantage of them in some way. And it really explored that power dynamic in a lot of ways. And was also like, this wasn't Courtney Summers' first book, but it was really the book that kind of threw her onto the map. And I remember reading a Book Riot article, I think from Kelly, I'm not remembering, about like that kind of moment of an author like breaking through and it kind of being positioned as their debut, but really it's not. They've been working really hard behind the scenes. And that's part of what I think in terms of developing voices. I go back to things like that, where it takes authors a couple of books. And, here we have 2 examples back to back with V.E. Schwab and Courtney Summers. And I can't imagine not having either of those. So, and then we move into Aleph the Unseen by G. Willow Wilson, which I should revisit a lot of these, but I remember this having like the most fun kind of portrayal of a Jenny that I'd read at that time or so far, and I think it had a really interesting aspect of technology and computers in that as well. So I remember that one being a lot of fun. And then I went into my first Stacey Lee, Under a Painted Sky, which is kind of an anomaly because it is a Western. And I'm fairly confident that I picked this up based on a Book Riot recommendation. In fact, a lot of these books I probably picked up based on a Book Riot recommendation because this was like the height of Book Riot for me, or my readership of Book Riot. And I remember like loving Book Riot. I wanted to write for Book Riot, and I don't interact with their content as much today, unfortunately. But I picked this up despite the fact that it was a Western, but it was a YA historical. And as you know, I now consider Stacey Lee and June Her are my 2 favorite, I think, current YA historical authors. And granted, I am a little behind. I also love the Davenports, though I need to catch up. So there are authors that are existing in the space, but I'm not ignoring those. I'm just saying how much I love these 2 authors. And so this was the start of that love affair with Stacey Lee for me, despite the fact that, again, it's a Western. And then we have My Heart and Other Black Holes by Jasmine Warga, which I mentioned because it existed in a similar place narratively as All the Bright Places did, and I think it did better at it. And that's kind of what I have on that. And then Miss Marvel was my first comic series. I'd never really read comics, but I remember seeing a lot of buzz, and based on the fact that it was written by G. Willow Wilson and I had just read her book, I picked it up. and I haven't kept up with it, and I haven't watched the show, but if anything were to get me into the Marvel Universe, it would be this particular interpretation of Miss Marvel. And then the hits keep coming because we have Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard, which I specifically remember reading while apartment hunting on the train, and I remember really enjoying the twist in this book. I mean, it's been a decade. We know there was a twist in this book. And I thought it was fun. I mean, was it kind of cookie cutter in some of its portrayals? Yeah. Did I like the rest of the series? No. Did I read the rest of the series? Yes. So the first book in this was a lot of fun and was definitely huge at the time, and honestly continues to be huge in some ways. It's definitely still got traction. And then Written in the Stars by Aisha Saeed is notable for me because it is the first book I bought at the bookseller in Lincoln Square. And so it's very sentimental to me for that reason. I think I have it in my childhood bedroom because, again, I think I bought it while I was out apartment hunting. And I remember having seen the bookseller online somewhere, and I was like, I have to visit this bookstore. And that would not be the last time I visited that bookstore by any means. And then Poison Study by Maria V. Snyder. I need to revisit this series. And if you are a Romantasy fan that has not read this series, you need to read this series. I think especially at the beginning, it started out very much positioned as YA, but especially there was the original trilogy, and then I think there was a secondary trilogy, if I'm remembering correctly, and I do feel like it felt more mature as it went on, but like this is the kind of stuff I ate up, and I'm pretty sure I would eat up again. Like, I loved these books. And then Delicious Foods by James Hanahan, which has a story with it, in that I was reading this book when I interviewed for my bookseller job, which is relevant in the sense that, it was one of those questions like, what are you reading right now? And I said this book. And this book really stayed with me. It was darkly comedic, really exploring the kind of exploitation of class and the poor in terms of the food industry and harvesting. And it also has a point of view from crack. And it was just such an inventive book with such a distinct voice. And I convinced all of my fellow booksellers basically to read it, to the point where we had to pick hand sells, like books that we would sell and recommend to customers and try to kind of gamify it in some ways. Like, how many copies of this particular title can we sell? And we had to like kind of come to an agreement as a book selling team on a team-wide choice rather than just like the books that we gravitated to. And so I basically convinced everyone for it to be this book. And we were so passionate about this book, but we didn't really convince too many people to buy it because it's not as broadly like appealing as something like, again, this is the era of The Girl on the Train and The Nightingale. So very, very different narrative vibe. But we loved it. And I remember we got a new manager at one time and we got along very well, but he was kind of talking about picking a hand sell, and he mentioned, because he'd gone through the data, the kind of fiasco of Delicious Foods and who picked that. And I was like, it was me. I picked that. And I'd do it again. And then we've got more of the Poison Study series, So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson. I want him to revisit this book because this book is what it says. It's about the idea of public shaming, but it's before we really had or used the verbiage of canceled and the idea of cancellation, which I don't really believe people are canceled, and I don't believe cancellation is an attack as much as accountability at points, but there's also that pile-on component. But all of that in its spirit really is explored in this book. And I really should revisit it with that kind of extra decade of existing on the internet and the way that the internet has evolved, because it really is getting to a lot of that and is kind of commenting on it in like the Twitter era and the way that things move quickly and how that kind of became the norm in a lot of ways. So I thought that that book was really interesting. And then Instinct by Sherilyn Kenyon is notable in that, like with the Kathy Reichs young adult spinoff of the Bone series, this is a young adult spinoff of Sherilyn Kenyon's Dark Hunter series, told through the perspective of a teenage boy. And I remember listening to these and they were fun, but they're very like of a time. But I remember them like making me want, because this is a character that appears in the Dark Hunter series to whatever degree, and there's like a clear, fate of some kind that's coming. And I just remember this making me really want to continue with the Dark Hunter series to get to Acheron's book, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, because it's been 10 years since I listened to these audiobooks, it seems. But clearly I did not do that. And when Acheron's book came out, it was so long. It continues to be so long because it's still the same book, but I don't know, maybe I should try that again. I don't know. And then, okay, The Virgin's Daughter by Laura Anderson. I maybe skipped over another Laura Anderson. She wrote, or these books were, reimagined alternate Tudor history. So like one of the series, it may have been this one, was, what if Anne Boleyn did have a son? So these were a lot of fun. Me from the future jumping in real quick because I completely glossed over Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda because that's how stacked this year was apparently. But this was such a pivotal release in 2015. I loved this book so much. It would, of course, go on to become the rom-com Love, Simon, which was just as great in my mind. There were differences between the two, obviously, small ones, but to be able to see this work come out was fantastic, and to have a rom-com of this nature, I think Simon and Dumplin in particular are really of a moment for me, and they obviously came out the same year. I also actually saw Becky Albertalli and Julie Murphy at a signing together back around the time that Leia on the Offbeat came out. So they're linked in my mind that way too, but just how pivotal and big those works were in 2015 and continue to be, and that they're coming across a 10-year anniversary is wild, but didn't want to let Simon versus the Homo sapien agenda slip through the cracks there because I absolutely should have called it out. I love that book. Then we've got a nice Amanda Quick showing. I need to get back into Amanda Quick. And then, plot twist, we have A Court of Thorns and Roses. Apparently I read that a decade ago. What I will say about that book, that I was thinking at the time, and continues to be true, is that that book is not a Beauty and the Beast reimagining. It is an East of the Sun, West of the Moon reimagining. That is all. And then Miss Mayhem by Rachel Hawkins. I loved this series. This was the second in the Rebel Belle series, and it was pitched and was like Southern Buffy. It was like, what if Buffy was a Southern Belle? And what if she had to team up with her academic rival to slay the demons? This series was a lot of fun. And if you, well, they're very different, but if you like her thrillers, I would encourage you to check out some of her young adult. She has a lot of like really fun, like fantasy paranormal kind of young adult, and it's very pithy. And I remember her switch into adult and being understanding because the young adult market shifted very drastically between 2015 and the current market, but I loved those books. Books I didn't love but still read, and why? The Air by Kiera Cass. Like, why did I read the fourth selection book? I didn't like the selection books. They were not well written, but they were addictive in some ways. Like, I wanted to know how campy it was gonna get. Anyway, Luckiest Girl Alive by Jessica Knoll, I think has a movie. I didn't like this book. I still remember being really frustrated by the pacing of this book. So I have beef with the pacing of The Luckiest Girl Alive, and I thought I'd read it later, but apparently I didn't. The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh, on the other hand, which was a Thousand and One Nights retelling, loved that book. We have The Beautiful Bastard era of Christina Lauren. We have Royal Wedding by Meg Cabot, which, thank goodness, was so much better than the kind of grown-up continuation of the Mediator series. That book actively made me angry. And maybe I haven't read that one yet, timeline-wise, but Royal Wedding was a lot of fun. We got to catch up with Mia and Michael, and they had babies, and it's just a lot of fun. So it was nostalgic. I loved that. And then China Rich Girlfriend, which means the movie could still come out, and it would only be 10 years after I read the book. We can dream. Free Stallion, the poetry collection by Amber Tamlin, I read because she was at Printers Row Lit Fest the first year. So I picked up that poetry collection at Printers Row Lit Fest after hearing her speak. Empire of Sin by Gary Christ, I listened to on audio, and is a reimagining, or it's a history of the Jazz Age in New Orleans combined with the true crime of the first axe murderer. And I just really like the way that he kind of intertwines culture or uses historical true crime to kind of explore the culture of specific places and times. I really enjoyed that. The Invasion of the Tierling, the sequel to The Queen of the Tierling, which The Queen of the Tierling was so refreshing when it came out. I loved that book so much. And The Invasion of the Tierling started to get weird. And I was kind of on the fence. I was like, where are we going? I'm willing to go along for the ride. Whether or not it pays off in the third book is up to you. I don't think it does. I thought it got kind of weird. Anyway, speaking of weird, The Royal We by Heather Cox was, a fun royal romance at the time. In retrospect, it's basically William and Kate fanfiction. And that is weird. The other daughter is Lauren Willig outside of The Secret History of the Pink Carnation series, which was starting to wrap up. The Princess in Black by Shannon Hale, such a cute series, one I still like to gift to young readers. Go Set a Watchman. Okay, I had beef with this book. So I was a bookseller during the release of Go Set a Watchman. So if you weren't around or really in reader spaces at that time, this was like a huge deal, but also kind of controversial because it was the publishing of Harper Lee after she died. And it was essentially a first draft, an early draft imagining of To Kill a Mockingbird that Harper Lee really didn't want to see the light of day. And it was a very different book. It was framed much differently. It involved like a grown-up scout going home and kind of recontextualizing her home and her father in particular. Put a pin in that. But in the lead up, they were milking it for all it was worth. And like, I get it, Harper Lee is a huge institution in the American literary canon, particularly To Kill a Mockingbird. However, I remember like the Barnes & Noble did a full read-through of To Kill a Mockingbird like the day before release. So basically, if you came into the store, there were just booksellers doing shifts of reading To Kill a Mockingbird on the sales floor, and you could go and listen and have like a live audiobook. Mileage will vary on your narration, but that was what was going on. However, they didn't give a whole lot of guidance to that in the sense of some of the language that is in To Kill a Mockingbird that people may or may not feel comfortable reading out loud, even within the context of the novel. Things that maybe you shouldn't be asking your minimum wage hourly workers to do. And then I remember the book came out, and I started it like a whole hour. I stayed up late reading it. I started it a whole hour early because I had it on hold digitally through the Cleveland Library, which I still had a library card for at the time, and they were an hour ahead, so it downloaded at 11. So I started reading because I wanted to be able to talk about it at my shift to whatever degree. I knew customers were going to have questions about it or going to want to talk about it. And it was just such a character assassination of Atticus. And I mean, I get it. Like, kill your heroes, whatever. Like, that's been my life, it feels like, in adulthood. But man, did we really... That, honestly, now that I think about it, should that have been a harbinger for what was to come? Was Go Set a Watchman actually the Watchman? Man. Anyway, The Summer of Chasing Mermaids by Sarah Auckler, I remember being like a cute YA romance that I mostly remember reading while eating Arby's in the Thompson Center food court. RIP to the Thompson Center food court. You will be missed by me. I'm gonna skip ahead here because I feel like I've been babbling for a bit. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I read in anticipation of the movie, and then I didn't see the movie. And I liked it well enough to my recollection, but I don't really remember it, which is interesting in context of Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure, which have at least one scene is still stuck very much in my mind from either book, and it doesn't feel like there is a scene that is quite as devastating to my recollection in that book, but I could be wrong. Let me tell you, the Shirley Jackson book, loved that, loved some Shirley Jackson. The Fair Fight by Anna Freeman is a really expansive, great historical fiction about lady boxers, and is fun because I remember when when the third in the Bare Knuckle Bastards series came out, I was listening to Fated Mates. And either like, I think I'd already read the book. Anyway, something in the conversation, Sarah was talking about doing this research and whatnot. And I remember thinking about the fair fight. I was like, this sounds like the fair fight when we're talking about lady boxers. And then Sarah mentioned that book, and I was like, yes, we are on the same wavelength. So if you're looking for some good historical fiction, definitely check out The Fair Fight. And then Geek Girl by Holly Small was definitely like very reminiscent to me of like the Meg Cabot or the Angus Thongs and Full Frontal Snogging kind of era or genre of young adult, though, you know, she becomes a model, you know, the kind of nerd girl becomes a model. I thought they were fun. And then Awkward was a great start to a graphic novel series, a middle grade graphic novel series that I don't remember that being a decade ago. I remember them being like fun and fresh and like another selection in graphic novels. And so, yeah, those were cute. The Lure of the Moonflower, was this the last in the Pink Carnation series, or was it second to last? I remember like this being kind of like the culmination. It was the last. So I remember this being kind of like the end of an era for me in some ways in relation to the Pink Carnation series. So that was kind of bittersweet. A Curious Tale of the In-Between by Lauren DiStefano is like good middle grade horror. Not too scary, but also scary enough because like we don't give kids enough credit sometimes for what they want in horror. Like I was of the era of scary stories to tell in the dark, so like they appreciate some horror. Dumplin' by Julie Murphy, which I cannot reconcile being 10 years old. I remember wanting this arc so much. I think I ended up getting it. It was available at the bookstore. But this book was just such a breath of fresh air. The movie was sweet, obviously, too, but just like how revolutionary this book felt. And it still brings me a lot of joy to think about. So, love Dumplin'. Between the World and Me, no further comment really needed. This is on the prestigious list of books that I have since lost, of books that made me cry in a potbelly. I am honestly very sad to have lost this list. However, there are multiple entries in 2015 for that list. The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, I'm not gonna lie to you, I read because everyone was talking about it, and I read it at the cash register. Modern Romance, I read on the way to a wedding. Lumberjanes, I loved Lumberjanes. I wish we had a Lumberjanes series. That would be so fun. I loved those girls. Lumberjanes is a delight. If for some reason you have not read Lumberjanes, read Lumberjanes. Melissa by Alex Gino. When did this book come out? Has it been 10 years or did it come out? Oh my gosh, yeah. Okay, so I read it the year it came out. Wild that so many of these books are having 10-year anniversaries. The Haunting of Hill House. This must have also been the first time I read The Haunting of Hill House, which is also kind of mind-boggling. The Doll by Daphne du Maurier. I have gone through Daphne du Maurier phases, so of course I wanted to read those short stories. I don't know that I'm up to date. I think there was recently a short story compilation released, so I'm sure I haven't read all of the stories in that. I'll have to swing back for that. Spinster by Kate Bullock. I remember having beef with this book because I was very interested, and to a certain extent continue to be very interested in books that kind of contend with being single and being alone in whatever connotation. And I think I am more interested in the framing of it being kind of incidental, like whether it be accidental or, you know, it is just how life is going and has turned out, and, you know, whatever feelings are attached to that. However, it felt like this book, to my recollection, was framed by the active choice, which too, I don't think you can claim the label of spinster if you're making an active choice. Maybe, like it's a badge of honor. Fine, okay. Maybe I need to recontextualize this. However, I remember kind of chafing at this because what, especially at this time in my life, what I wanted from this was some kind of reassurance and to kind of hear someone in a similar situation to me where we were just single and hadn't been in a relationship and it just hadn't happened. And instead I had a woman, because I was listening to it on audio, telling me about her actively making choices to stay single, which is a valid point of view, but it felt very different from what I wanted or needed at that time. And then we have the A Little Life of It All, which of course is on the list of books that made me cry in a potbelly, because how can that list exist, especially during my potbelly era, because this was my potbelly era, and this book not be on it. And I, you know, to whatever degree of conversation, valid conversation and critique around this book exists today, I recommended this book. I talked about it, and it definitely impacted me, and my roommates can attest to that. Like, I think I read this over the course of a week, and my mood really shifted. And I think, there's probably something to be said about the nature of the book in that as well. Now, when I read her next book after this, was it Of Paradise? I could start to see trends emerged that kind of recontextualized some of that and are part of that conversation about Yanagihara and how she approaches her characters and the kind of torture of it all. But at the time, I did really emotionally respond to this book. Then we have Maid of Wonder by Jennifer McGowan, because clearly I was churning through this entire series over the course of the year. Beastly Bones by William Ritter, which is part of the Jacoby series, which, if what was it billed as? Kind of like Sherlock meets Doctor Who, I think, which definitely is 2015, but it's like Sherlock meets Doctor Who with kind of a gothic twist, because it's kind of like pseudo-Victorian or real Victorian. And then Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, which was a huge release for me at the time that this book came out, despite the fact that I have not finished this series. Meeting Rainbow Rowell was huge for me at the time. I remember talking about $5 Target tights with her, and this was a great day with me and my roommate. Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. 2015 was also the year where I had a list of books that was Fates and Furies and A Little Life, and I don't remember the other, of books that had dramaturgs just mentioned in them. Very different books, though, and if you've come to Lauren Groff in recent years, this is a much different book as well, in that it's the exploration of the breakdown of a marriage from either perspective. And for being a woman in my early mid-20s that was completely single when I read this book, and this brand of literary fiction really wasn't where I was gravitating, this just had so much hype, I wanted to read it. I really did love this book. And then, of course, The Six of Crows of it all. I can't believe it's been 10 years. Like, intellectually, I think I knew that this book lived with all of these other books in terms of timing, but wild. I remember reading this book, being excited about it because I liked the Shadow and Bone series, but then my friend Mandy also read this book, despite the fact that she was not interested in the Shadow and Bone series because she wasn't interested in the kind of romance at the center of it or that angle, but she loved Six of Crows because there's just a sprinkle. There's just a little sprinkle for us that are interested in that, but you can get by without. I don't need to tell you about Six of Crows. Wild that it's been a decade. And then drama, I was reading books that I could recommend to middle grade readers or that middle grade readers were interested in. And of course, this along with like Awkward were very much what readers were interested in at that time. The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness is perfect if you love the episode of Buffy the Zeppo. Like, Xander aside, Xander's kind of the worst, but the concept of this book is like the outcasts and watching the chosen ones kind of saving the world on the periphery. So they'll just be going about their life, and then there's like doomsday stuff happening in the background. A lot of fun. We have a good little burst here because next is Cold Hearted Rake by Lisa Kleypas, which is the first in the Ravenel series, which is her most recent completed series and also just her most recent series. And what if I confessed to you that this was my first Lisa Kleypas? Because I'm pretty sure it was. Like, I started with the Ravenels, which is why I need to swing back, because I've obviously read the Wallflowers since then, which tie in really significantly to some of the Ravenel's books. And by the last book, I was caught up and like caught all of that. But there are a couple books in the middle that I missed the full appreciation of from that perspective. But I really loved this book and the way it set up the second book in particular. So this was a great entry to Kleypas for me. And then Jennifer Donnelly with The Shallow Graves. I love Jennifer Donnelly historical fiction. Like, I came up on A Northern Light in high school, and I would go on to read the Rose trilogy that started with like the Tea Rose, and this was Jennifer Donnelly historical fiction, but about grave robbing. So again, part of like that gothic kind of impetus that we were seeing in a certain brand of young adult at this time, because this was a young adult historical fiction. It's starting to get dark now, if you notice the light changing, because it's not winter, but daylight savings. And then another Meg Cabot from the Princess Diaries universe. We have From the Notebooks of a Middle School Princess, which is the middle grade return of the Princess Diaries from Mia's half-sister that we didn't know about. I'm going to be very, very interested because I saw Meg Cabot post that the new Princess Diaries movie is casting an Olivia, but in the movies, Mia's father died. So I don't know how they're going to approach this, but I also just love the idea of passing off the Princess Diaries to a new generation. it makes me emotional. So I definitely have my eye on that, and that is a lot of fun. And then, okay, Fans of the Impossible Life by Kate Skelza is interesting because it's not like a super well-known book by any means, and part of that is why I want to mention it. I remember it's kind of like realistic young adult, but it's following three friends and kind of like the passing of the night. It's very kind of in the same vein as The Perks of Being a Wallflower in a lot of ways. But what was notable about it to me, to my recollection, was that each character is told from a different point of view, including one person from second point of view. I know, but it worked in this for me. And it's also notable because I remember seeing it on one of the banned lists from, I think, Texas, and is like a clear illustration of, I think we get, and I've mentioned before, there's a lot of conversation about book banning, and there's this tendency to be like, well, if it's banned, it's going to become more popular and we're going to rally behind it. But so many books are banned or challenged that like never see the light of day, or, are kind of soft challenge, soft banned, where people will kind of curate their collection with banning in mind, but also like these mid-list books that kind of fall through the cracks still and then have even less access for students or their audience to find them. So that's kind of interesting, if also a bummer in context. I think we're getting to the end here. The Margot Jefferson was a great memoir. I really enjoyed it. I think I read it most specifically because it takes place, a large part of it, in Chicago. I think if you liked the Michelle Obama memoir, you should definitely check that out if you haven't already. The Unfinished World and Other Stories by Amber Sparks. I think, didn't Amber Sparks just last month have her first novel come out? I remember really enjoying her short stories. And Ember in the Ashes. We had so many huge books coming out this year. Like, this was a huge time for especially young adult, but like this was a great time. Illumini, which is interesting in context of kind of like how I saw this as a response from publishers in terms of form, kind of responding to the rise of ebooks and e-readers, because there was this emphasis on the physicality of it and the physical reading experience being different in the physical book versus the ebook, and there being a benefit there. So that's really interesting contextually, or like in context. Slade House by David Mitchell is a companion piece to The Bone Clocks, which I read in 2014, and I loved The Bone Clocks. But one thing I remember so specifically about that book is how it feels like there's all this odd stuff happening just in the periphery, and Slade House, we get to see it a little bit more centered, and so I really enjoyed that. Welcome to Night Vale is a kind of transcript of the popular podcast that is very much of its time, and also I enjoy. I'm very far behind, I'm very out of the loop on it, but I did really enjoy that podcast from a time, and I remember specifically one weather song sitting there and being like, this is based on the Angel episode, A Hole in the World, and it was. And then, yeah, we have The Doldrums, which is a middle grade. I don't remember a whole lot about it. I think I read it on my friend Mandy's recommendation because she was the children's lead and had great middle grade recommendations. The Second and the Legend series. Apparently, I read a lot of the Survivors Club this year and just completely misremembered the timeline. And all I'll say about Career of Evil is that I wish I hadn't wasted so much time on that series. So yeah, definitely more of a kind of overview, but kind of gives you a peek into who I was as a reader in 2015, and also kind of like where we were in publishing in 2015, because that was a lot of books. And I haven't read that many books probably since my 20s, but I enjoyed it when it was happening, and there were a lot of great ones. Like, we had a lot of really good books in that list. There were some that were not as good, and we just didn't touch on, and some that weren't as good that we did touch on. But again, that's my personal opinion. And I'd be very interested to hear, like, did any of these stick out to you? Do you remember reading any of these in 2015? Or have you read any of them since? Because we do have a number on here that have really stayed in the zeitgeist and were interesting, because there's some, like Six of Crows, that were kind of revitalized and are now considered like book talk books, but they came up in 2020 on Book Talk and were kind of revitalized. But I kind of chafed against the idea that they were made popular by Book Talk, because these were bestsellers when they came out. And so we see the kind of cyclical nature of it, but also that these are the books that continue to resonate with people and be popular. And it's kind of interesting to see what has resonated, like what has last and is still read and recommended more actively, and what kind of seems to be more of a product of the time. And also like thinking about like the kind of explosion of young adult, or how much young adult was here. but that by young adult standards, this is like 3 generations of young adult ago at this point, and that is wild. So, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on these books, your thoughts on 2015, what you read in 2015, again, if you read any of these and what your thoughts are. But thank you for hanging out with me and letting me go down memory lane a little bit and be a little bit vulnerable because, like I said, to a certain extent, it does kind of feel like sharing my journal entries. But thanks for coming along for the ride. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,